collective
That's
guest
neat.
lecture.
That's neat. So there we go. I think we're online, hey?
Okay. Hi, hello. We will have a webinar of 5 people today on cultural policies in the future, civil society and cities. And I'm very pleased to have 4 friends today who would talk about how the cultural policies evolve generally and in cities with the contribution of civil society, including problems, challenges, possible solutions, and so on. Let me quickly first make a short introduction about our hosts. You can see the black square, black and blue square on one corner, BCF. BCF stands for Bosjada Jazz Festival. And for those of you who don't know where is Bosjada, Bosjada is an island on northern Aegean in the area of Troy, not very far from Iliad and Odyssey lands. And its name in the history was Tenedos. And this jazz festival, as many other artistic events, went in digital this year. And in its new version, it was baptized as 2020 Exploration, meaning also exploring the horizon of this new, let's say, squeezed, stressed world we are living in right now, all of us. And they have adopted a theme called autotelic, meaning having a purpose intrinsically and not apart from itself. So it's a sort of a self-targeted theme for this year. And the 3 partners of the festivals are 3 Dots, Alla Turca, and Fermente. And in this respect, they didn't only organize webinars like ours, and I will quickly nominate them, but also music performances recorded in Tenedos, and also, I think, a CD digitally. So we are, I think, the final issue of the series of webinars. There was a webinar, very interesting webinar on what is digital accessibility. And then another one with wonderful experts on cultural diversity with the title of Diversity of Cultural Expressions and Its Development. Then we also had another title like From Tenedos to Bosjada, rather a historical overview. Then is a sustainable festival possible, which is also a very interesting and intriguing title. So today we'll talk about cultural policies, and let me introduce my friends and our guests today. I will start with Dea Vidovic. Dea is from Zagreb, Croatia. Hello, Dea. She is the director of Culturanova Foundation, a public foundation working in collaboration with civil society organizations in the field of culture and the arts. And maybe she will mention about it, but they also recently organized, I think in September, sort of a conference on elitism and cultural democracy. Then our second guest is Friederike Landau. Friederike is from Berlin originally, and she worked a lot on the Independent Cultural Coalition in Berlin. And she wrote her PhD on this subject, and she is now a faculty in Radboud University in Nijmegen. Hello. Then we have Stephen Sack from South Africa, Johannesburg. Stephen has been very active on different fields of culture and the arts in a broad range of disciplines like education, management of artistic and cultural production, and so on. But specifically, he worked for a community art project in Soweto during the apartheid period, 1985. And then also he was the person who drafted the mapping of South African cultural and creative entrepreneurial ecosystem. Our fourth guest is Jordi Balta. Jordi is a researcher and trainer in transit projects in L'Hospitalet de Llobregat. Am I correct? Probably not, because I cannot read in Catalan.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Okay, in Barcelona. And Jordi used to be an expert and an executive in the UCLG Culture Committee, and an expert through UNESCO and many other cultural networks. So welcome, everyone. And I want us to think first on cultural policies as a construct which is becoming something different that we used to know. Because in the beginning, cultural policy was something like cultural administration, maybe half a century ago. French bureaucrats, illuminated by a certain André Malraux, were thinking that there would be a benevolent ministry helping all of us, all the artists and so on, with measures, priorities, rules and principles and legislation to get things easy for all the artists, for all the cultural institutions and so on. Later on, maybe with the support of some Scandinavian northern countries in Europe, there was an idea of integrating cultural policy with development. The economic contribution of cultural policy, could it be to employment, to the national product, and so on. And lately, maybe after the 2005 Convention on Cultural Diversity, I think there was another aspect for a sort of world cultural policy, especially with the quadrennial reports where, I mean, global South countries started to contribute in a good extent. There was this approach of cultural diversity, also not to lose this variety we might have in cultural industries and so on, and also in favor of the independence and civil society. So very briefly, we could summarize that. Then in 2020, starting from China, but everywhere, things have come to a stop, a complete and sudden stop. So we were not totally aware that things will not be the same anymore. In Turkey, for instance, there was a sudden astonishment in a first phase, then a big surprise, and people were sort of desperate, in despair, trying to find solutions of, forget about the sustainability, but survival. So in our first round, I would like to start asking you, what is still the same in cultural policy and what has changed? And if you allow me, I would like to start with Dea. Dea?
Hello to everyone. Good day. I'm really happy that I got this opportunity to spend my afternoon discussing with you the changes around the cultural policy and the role of the civil society organization within the cultural policy. So talking about what has changed and what is still the same today within the cultural policy, on some point, especially if we contextualize this in the COVID pandemic, which is still here, on some point we can say that nothing has changed, according to the cultural policy, because the change happens outside of the cultural policy. And in some cases, the cultural policy on national or on the local levels reacted and defined a way how can deal with this changes and the crisis which happen. But basically the changes happen in the cultural sector without the influence of the cultural policy. The changes are results of the measures implemented in relations to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in some cases, for example, here in Zagreb, the changes also happened because of the material damage caused by the Zagreb earthquake, which shocked through the city on 22nd of March, almost on the beginning of the corona crisis. So in that sense, we can say that we live in a permanent crisis, and that the crisis for us is like a standard, remembering, of course, the turbulent period of the 90s and then all changes after that. But talking about the changes in the cultural policy, we can talk from many different perspectives, basically, from the historic perspective, but also from the differences among the stakeholders' perspectives. So in our preparation meetings in advance to our going online and being live on YouTube, you ask us to share somehow our experiences with the cultural policy. And talking about my experiences, I can say that I have somehow multi-headed animals, because I deal with the cultural policy from different perspectives, and each of them brings me plenty of characteristics and challenges. One of them is being a part of the practitioners, being on the ground in the cultural sector. And being part of the cultural sector means, or created, or my impression of the cultural policy was very particular, and was always linked to some of our own interest as a practitioner in some specific fields, on the local or the national level, doesn't matter. Then also I work as a researcher and educator. And it means that I can analyze, as a researcher, I can analyze the cases or different kind of examples, go deeper, and conduct different data. Based on that, I can make analysis, comparison among different fields and areas, and make some kind of the conclusions and this fantastic recommendation, But of course, the question is, what would be with this recommendation? Is anyone will take the recommendation in a practice, in the real cultural policy arena? Then as an educator, I can teach my students how the cultural policy frame organized, which kind of the elements basically created the cultural policy. And finally, as a policymaker, I have to have the whole picture all the time in my mind. Not only I, but all others, but it's of course depends on the policymakers, which are totally different all around, and it's also depends on the layer in which they work as a policymaker, on the national, subnational level, supranational. So you can basically create the frame of the cultural policy from different dimensions. But one of the main challenges which I see today in the whole system, in the whole structure, is that all of that perspective, which I shortly try to describe from my experiences and my perspective, in many cases work separately, without any interconnection among them. So this is what I see as the main challenges, of course, with some exceptions and trying to change, especially on the narrative and the rhetoric discursive way, you know. But in the practices, basically educator teach, research, analyze different kind of the data, make some conclusions, then practitioners work on the ground, and the policymaker finally made the decision. And in many cases, you know, without any participation of all that stakeholders which I mentioned. And where is the citizens in all that stories? You know, the position of the citizens are also changed through the history of the cultural policy. You mentioned, you know, that cultural policy start as an administration. And we can look at from the historical perspective, we can, you know, follow the different changes in cultural policy from different dimensions. And one of that dimensions could be participation, you know, and we can follow the paradigm of the cultural policy and how it's changed over the time, at least after the Second World War, to the perspective of the participation. Starting from this passive perspective of participation and understanding participation more from this traditional lenses to one which is a really contemporary understanding of participation, which count on very active participation of citizens and their involvement not only in the creation and the production and distributions, then also when we look on the scale of participation, the higher level of participation represent like control power. So which means opening decision-making process for the involvement of the citizens in this process. But however, just to finalize my first intervention, trying to pick some of the challenges and the points when we talk about the changes in a cultural policy, and to come back to this particular moment of COVID-19 context, I can say that many things changes, especially for the cultural sector, but what is still the same is the neoliberal system in which we live. So basically, what I would like to imagine or to work further is to change the system. Because if we change the system of neoliberalism, then we can imagine really the cultural policy for the 21st century, which would be based on the principles of equality, inclusion, solidarity, and so on. So with this final remarks, I will stop and give my other colleagues space to speak.
Well, thank you, Dea. I was thinking to have the floor with Steven, but as last week we were part of a working meeting with Friederike in Zeppelin University, not physically, obviously, virtually, and it was about the challenges for cultural policy and cultural work for in illiberal times. So we're always, all of us, talking about neoliberal system. And you were right to say that there were sort of pre-announcement that this crisis, with or without the virus, with or without the pandemic, was on the way. And also you mentioned that there is a sort of a lack of articulation between the research and then the policy making, sort of a disconnectedness. And so this is also two important challenges maybe we have to address during our webinar. So I would go to Friederike and ask her about her opinion for the change in cultural policies lately.
Okay, thank you, Zerhan. And thank you, Dea, for introducing your multiple hats you've been wearing in kind of looking at the recent developments of cultural policies in the crisis. I, for once, have basically only worn the one hat of being a researcher, but I have definitely been in different places throughout this crisis. So the pandemic started late January when I was still in Vancouver doing a postdoc. Late January, I remember I wanted to go to the Chinatown Spring Parade to kind of like celebrate the Chinese New Year, and audiences and you know, performances in the street were basically not as spread over the city as usual, and there was lots less people in the streets. Then in March, I moved back to home, actually to rural Germany, to spend 2 months with my parents. And then only I came back to Berlin, where I've been living. Now I am in the Netherlands, so I've gone through various stages, various relations of proximity and distance to changes with regards to cultural policies. So I'm just saying this because my way of observing things has been under construction. I've been on moving grounds, but not only me as an individual, but also I think lots of things have been on moving grounds for the past months and weeks. So the question, what has changed, what is still the same, is obviously a provocation, or I intend to read it as a provocation. Because I would say nothing is still the same, but nothing has ever been the same. So I take a very evolutionary, very constructivist approach to all of this. Because I've done most of my research on Berlin and the sort of like local urban cultural politics of Berlin and its subsequent activism from the artistic scenes, like Zerhan was introducing, I will also focus mostly on the urban cultural political changes in the past months in Berlin. And I think it's difficult to summarize it because there has been such a polyphonic way of responding to this crisis, which ranges from annulling funding programs, canceling shows, to significantly repackaging money that goes into the funding of artistic and cultural production. So from what I could observe at a distance, because I really haven't interacted with people in a long time, and usually my mode of understanding the field is to be very close to actors, is that cultural policymakers in the case of Berlin, but probably elsewhere as well, have turned into crisis managers. So this permanent crisis that Dea was also pointing to, or the permanent emergency mode, has become ever more normalized. And currently people are jumbling things, and people are jumbling public monies that are lying around and cannot be used in their common ways. I think it's been a multi-edged sword, this crisis. In a way, it has surfaced a lot of crises that have already been existing before. So those can be crises of representation, of diversity, of access, of legitimacy, also of the physical space that they take in cities. I'm thinking about museums, I'm thinking about theaters that have probably long preceded this crisis. On the other hand, I think this crisis has worked as an accelerator to problematize these crises. And this has led me to think a lot about the term vulnerability. So me trying to make sense of myself and make sense of my knowledge in this crisis has led me to write essays about what I call the cultural infrastructures of vulnerability, to think about how vulnerable we as cultural agents already are, how vulnerable cultural policies are, and how vulnerable cultural institutions are. So all of that I subsume under the term of cultural infrastructures. And it's been interesting that not only terms like vulnerability, but also terms such as care and solidarity have kind of had an upsurge, or have been in more people's mouths than before in the cultural sector, which I personally find something very very crucial to remember about this crisis, that it did spark, voluntarily or not, this kind of turn to a more human side of cultural policies. So not only thinking about funding excellent productions and innovative and participatory or digitalized cultural practices and productions, but also to think about who are the people who make art, and who are the people beyond being an artist. These people are also tenants. These people might be parents. These people might be differently bodied. They might have different capacities of being artists full time. And I think in a lot of ways, cultural policies have so far not taken into account this very human and vulnerable side of cultural policies. So in that sense, I perceive parts of this crisis as an opportunity, as, you know, boring this term is, the crisis is opportunity, but as a platform, also as a platform for activism, to kind of lobby more for cultural policies that take into consideration how vulnerable cultural producers and cultural infrastructures are. So those are some thoughts. Also, the topic of mental health, I think overall has become more visible in the cultural political realm, or maybe also in terms of cultural policies. I've seen lots of artist associations, unions, or, you know, professional advocacy organizations talking about the problems, the existential problems of survival, which I know we'll talk about later, in the sense that these things need to be talked about as well, like under what conditions do artists make art. So here I see, yeah, a lot of new conversations starting throughout the crisis. In that sense, I think not a lot of things are still the same. Maybe I will leave it at that. I would also like to talk about the flight, or the like spatial reconfiguration of the crisis, with moving into the public realm a lot. Not only the digital realm, but also the public realm, which in the case of Berlin has been a very contested process. So the city has wanted to provide more funding for arts in the public realm, which in the case of Berlin hasn't really had lots of funding background. But the main association that I've written my PhD on, the Coalition of the Independent Scene, the Koalition der Freien Szene, has criticized the process of how to make this funding available. So that's just a little teaser that I would like to talk about public space at some point, but I'll probably leave it at that with the summary that I think we're on moving grounds, and it looks like a lot of things that have been hovering in cultural policies for a long time have come to the surface, such as vulnerability and yeah, the mode of crisis. Thanks. You have to unmute, Serhan.
I think this emphasis on vulnerability and maybe at the same level of precarity will be announcing the times to come. And also your insistent accent on the word crisis, because now I will pass to the floor to Stephen, because I think we were all talking of sustainability at some point for culture, while crisis, I mean, is a different case, because I know that in the Department of Economics, everywhere, there are classes for developmental economy, but not classes for crisis. So let me ask to Stephen, what do you think in the post-apartheid South Africa today about cultural policies, because you went also through different phases, and now we are in a new era after the first sort of, at the end of the first quarter of the new century, practically.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with all of you and to hear all your different perspectives. I'm actually talking to you from Cape Town, And if you hear sounds in the background, it's because the house we live in is right on the street. And there are many homeless people who come knocking at the door. So we might hear voices as I proceed. I've had a very long career in working in arts, culture management and working as an artist. And I was thinking, you know, you used the words stressed and squeezed world. Well, in 1997, when I joined national government, we came out of, you know, the heights of apartheid, and we had to respond, even in that kind of stressed and squeezed world. There was we thought there was an extraordinary amount of solidarity. We'd experienced solidarity. We'd even managed to build alliances across class positions from our kind of essentially middle class positions. We built alliances with Black artists from the working class, and we'd been part and parcel of the emergence of a trade union movement. And we'd gone through, and I've been through all of those phases of cultural policy that you described, you know, of integrating cultural policy into development. And we became actually the benevolent ministry. When I was in government from 1997 to 2005, we increased the national budget for the Department of Arts and Culture by 1/3. And that was all done on the back of making creative economy arguments. The cultural industry's growth strategy enabled us to talk to the Ministry of Finance, gave us the language. We could throw data and statistics at them. And before we knew it, we had a mass of new money coming into the sector at an unprecedented scale. I mean, South Africa is the only country on the continent that has an annual budget for arts and culture from National Treasury and has some capacity in provinces. So we had this extraordinary flourish. And what makes me feel optimistic about the moment we're in now is that we were on our knees at that time because of the destructiveness of apartheid. And we emerged out of it and we created a renaissance of new work and new opportunity. And the greatest beneficiaries of that work have been women, and particularly Black women. I mean, South Africa, if I look at the South Africa that I grew up in and the South Africa that we have today, 3 decades of development have not only liberated women, but have created gender diversity and created platforms for gender diversity. But all of that has happened with the backdrop of an incapable state, a state with great policy and across all our sectors, and extraordinary resources that were available to re-engineer the economy. And then this terrible failure that we experienced pre-COVID. So we were already in crisis last year and the year before. We were already in crisis. And a lot of the crisis had to do, I mean, obviously the problems of liberal democracy and globalization, yes, these are all factors. But I've worked in the project of national government that was tied to globalization and international cooperation. And we saw a lot of benefits from that. I think the biggest challenge has been the state failure and the lack of capability within the state. Secondly, an economy that was not a shared economy. As the economy grew, it did not create jobs. It was very much driven by the services sectors, and where we had tourism, we did quite well. Mining collapsed. And then we had this massive movement of people into the cities. And we have very, very poor municipal government. Government at the municipal level is generally very poor. So we had this huge arrival of people from the towns and from rural areas and from Southern Africa and from the continent. We have this massive inward migration of people looking for opportunities to benefit from the post-apartheid opportunities that were being indicated. And then we had incompetent state and then tragically corruption. And those were the things that we were grappling with. Now, the way in which I've been able to deal with this has to do with the last job, the formal job that I had, where I was the CEO of the Origin Center at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is a center that tells the story of the origins of humans in Africa. And it goes back 180,000 years to the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens living, in fact, just a few hours up the road.
Stephen, just not to interrupt you, it seems that in Morocco, in Jebel Yahud, they found new skulls.
Evidence.
Going back to 300,000 years. And
Correct.
It is up to several thousands of kilometers, 11,000 or something, yeah.
Correct. So what they have in common, what Southern Africa, so it's, the period is interesting because it's a period of great global stress. It's a period of glaciations. So when you look at the conditions of life 200,000 years ago, you got the ocean continually rising and falling, and you've got these glacial periods. And the reason why Homo sapiens survive in Morocco and on the southern tip of Africa is because of the climatic and environmental conditions that enables humans to survive. So I think when I deal with kind of how to understand our time, I kind of want to say to people, visit archaeology museums. Go and look at deep time. Don't just look at shallow time. Look at deep time. Understand how humanity has evolved in these deeper time scenarios, and then start to understand the solutions that the San, the Bushmen, the indigenous people of our planet, the instruments and the mechanisms for survival. And so that's where I've been in most recent times, and found it very fruitful and enriching to be able to have this larger frame, not just look at modernist art and postmodernist and the kind of European tradition. Try and look at the pre-European, the pre-colonial, and that's really where my head is at the moment.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think that the three guests till now agree on the fact that there is this constant squeeze of the crisis, not only probably on the cultural sector, but everywhere. And you righteously mentioned about the larger frame to look at, not the narrow frame. And Jordi is an appropriate expert who has worked around the world, I could say, practically, not only in Barcelona where he works right now, but also in other parts of the world, and could also observe and comment on different types of cultural realities. So how should we cope with this state being more and more absent from cultural policy?
Thank you very much, Serhan. Well, first also to the Bosjada Festival for the invitation, to you for the introduction, and also for the suggestive reflections you were making just a few minutes ago, introducing, say, the reflection on how the notion of cultural policy has evolved and how it can have multiple meanings. To give my take on that, I mean, I suppose my position with regard to cultural policy is mainly as a researcher and consultant, as well as a trainer around issues of cultural policy in a variety of institutions and contexts. And I suppose what is of particular interest to me has to do with the position of citizens as regards cultural policy. So indeed there can be many understandings of cultural policy, and one of them has to do with how it can broaden opportunities for people to take part in cultural life. So somehow my connection to cultural policy, or my understanding of an ideal cultural policy, has to do with how it can broaden the opportunities for people to exercise their cultural rights. So the place of citizens as regards cultural policy. And that's also somehow linked to a concern with the values that underpin cultural policy, and to a reflection on, say, if we understand, or one of the understandings of culture is the way in which we make sense of our lives. So to what extent cultural policy can enable and can generate a context in which people can make sense of their lives. And of course, and how we can recognize that there are multiple ways of making sense of our lives. So a concern of diversity with diversity is also very central to me in understanding cultural policy. I suppose with regard to the reflection on what is changing, I very much agree with several of the points made in trying to understand this in a somehow longer frame, or longer term view, which allows us to see some of the contextual changes, but also how we are realizing of some of the weaknesses or some of the crises that were already pre-existing, and how some of these have been accelerated in the last few months. So just there's particularly three aspects which to me have gained attention in the last few months, and some of them just emphasize some of the weaknesses that already existed, but I'd like to pay attention to these three. One of them is, say, how in the context of COVID-19, there has been an acceleration of the changes in the forms of production, distribution, and access to culture, or what we would call the cultural value chain, particularly through the increase in digital forms of production and distribution and access, but also how that ends up having strong implications in the business models. And of course, many business models were already weak beforehand, but in this context, it has become more obvious what weaknesses existed. And that's visible both online, but also now, I mean, recent months across Catalonia and Spain, it has been little by little possible to do some performances, to do some shows, to open museums, etc. But very often the formats or the number of members of the audience have changed. There is pressure on artists to reduce their fees, and so on and so forth. So both online and offline business models become weaker and less sustainable. And one of the potential implications is the inequalities within the cultural sectors becoming more extreme. So somehow the vulnerability and the precarity that already existed becoming more extreme, and making it more difficult, or making it less affordable for those in more vulnerable positions within society to try and develop a career in the cultural and creative sectors. And ultimately that might also have an impact in having less diverse forms of expression in the public realm. So I think that's one of the trends that I see happening, and which is of concern. Suppose the second element has to do with how, in the context of the pandemic, there is an increase, or there is potential increasing mistrust of one another, an increasing fear of the other, that might be someone that might infect us. We are increasingly having borders closed. There is a certain fear that viruses might come from abroad, and therefore we need to close connections, etc. So I think there are a number of implications of that, of potentially leading to a more individualistic, self-centered world, both within societies and internationally. and that affects both mentalities, but also actual practice. So I think going back also to the reflection of the role of civil society, I think there is a potential role for civil society there in maintaining networking across borders, but also somehow generating spaces in which to foster meetings and encounters within society, and also somehow through creative work, trying to foster empathy and care towards different forms of suffering. And let's say, I suppose part of this self-centeredness we are going through is that all attention tends to be focused on COVID-19, but of course there are many other forms of suffering which were pre-existing as well. So that reflection around those forms of suffering and weakness, I think is important as well. And the third aspect, which to me is interesting and probably in a more positive light, is how there have also been a number of public discourses from public authorities emphasizing the importance of culture as an element which is essential for personal and collective well-being. And we've seen that in the lockdown, and we've seen that in some countries after lockdown, adopting statements that say culture is an essential public good. Recently, there has been a statement in that respect in Catalonia. At the Spanish level, there's also some steps being adopted in that respect. So I think there is a certain realization that culture should have a more central position within the elements to which public attention should be devoted. But of course, to what extent that is then translated into actual policies will very much depend on actual political will and on the capacity for, let's say, culture to defend its space and to reaffirm its space in a context in which there will be a lot of pressure on public fundings. But that's something that we can maybe discuss later.
Thank you very much, Jordi. I think also your point that cultural policy is for better life of the citizens or to improve their quality of life is something that we tend to forget from time to time. Even us, the researchers or the scholars, we tend to forget. And also, I think we all agree at the end that the virus or the pandemic is not the reason of the current crisis. When I say crisis, I always think that at some point, the price of oil went to minus, meaning they were paying you money just to empty their tanker because the thing went also in big trouble, and the virus was only a manifestation and not a reason. And the second thing we tend to forget, maybe because, as Stephen also pointed out, that when culture was sort of put forward and or instrumentalized as a driver for development or for the economy per se, we were maybe tended to forget about this. So in our second round, I want us to think of civil society, because I think that the understanding that civil society is a major stakeholder in cultural policy, not only the practice, but also the making of cultural policy. So in some sense, we will have to come back to the idea of vulnerability, precarity, and also at the same time trying to find out if there is this bridge between the society the activism in civil society in the field of culture with other communities. And this sort of, let's say, interaction or dialogue, or shall we also call it solidarity? So I would give the floor to Friederike because she worked on two important concepts. One is antagonism and the other one is agonism. With respect to Berlin, but also generally speaking. Friederike?
Yes, thank you. I had actually been thinking about the relationship between civil society and my research in the narrower sense of the term. So the topic of my dissertation was the emergence and the collectivization and the mobilization, or in a way, the encounter between differently dispersed artist communities in the city of Berlin. So those could be professional poets, visual artists, performance artists, jazz musicians, independent musicians, people who run artist-run galleries. And the story of the Koalition der Freien Szene, the coalition of the independent scene, is the kind of coming together of all these different parts. And if I'm trying to think about in what ways this coalition of the independent cultural scene is representative of civil society in Berlin or vice versa, I'm not really sure about the entanglements. So this is actually a question that only this panel makes me raise in front of myself. Because the way that I've looked at it, also coming from a political science approach or social movement studies, I was thinking more in terms of new forms of political representation and agency. So I think what I was writing about was the coming into being, or the articulation, as I call it, of a new collective actor, which was a segment of civil society. But at the same time, I think many of the claims that artist-led movements make also speak to greater civil society. And this is maybe exactly those hidden links or unproblematized or just not articulated links that there are between artist advocacy or activisms and civil society. So in the city of Berlin, probably many people who are listening, or also the panelists, have been to the city of Berlin and know that arts and culture play a very big role in the sort of like self-marketization, self-branding experience, the urban experience of being in Berlin. So that any, citizen or temporary resident of Berlin would identify in some ways with arts and culture as being a big part of the urban fabric in Berlin. But then I don't know to what extent the very nitty gritty, sometimes very technocratic and very, not so sexy kind of things that are subject of cultural policy then speak to what role and what importance, what public good, as Jordi was just saying, what type of public good arts and culture can be for an urban society, such as in the city of Berlin. So, like I said, I think I'm a bit more pondering about this question of the relationships. You also mentioned my focus on antagonism and agonism, which, just the one-on-one is a way of understanding the cultural field and also cultural policy as a negotiation of conflicts. So antagonism is the more confrontational approach of, a clash of different understandings, both normative and pragmatic, where we assume that a conflict cannot be resolved, so that there is a sort of like approach to kind of like the Carl-Schmittian friend-enemy logic of trying to annihilate the other party, which, in terms of cultural policy making or deliberative policy making or collaboration doesn't really get us very far. On the other hand, agonism and the way that I kind of portrayed the collectivization of the Berlin art scene drew more on this idea of agonism, which is the tamed version of antagonism. So more a negotiation between different ways of understanding culture and also different ways of understanding conflict and cultural policy, which leads to what Belgian philosopher Chantal Mouffe calls a conflictual consensus. So bearing in mind that certain conflicts about the normative role or the public legitimacy of arts and culture cannot be overcome, yet coming to terms and coming to such a conflictual consensus in the more operational field of cultural policy making. So to make decisions, to create new funding instruments, to give out money, to have people speak on panels, to get somewhere in this realm. And I wonder what we can learn from these kind of conflictual interactions amongst artist activists and cultural policymakers to then relate back to how this could influence a civil society or a sort of agonistic public in a way, if you will. So I haven't really done this sort of like scaling up and down of the question of where artist advocacy promotes ideals of a civil society. But I think what you can generally and also theoretically kind of take from it is that a more conflict attuned approach might help us to understand new models of civic agency, of civil society, whatever that is and whoever that is. But yeah, that's I think what fascinates me about looking at artist activism, of understanding why these people come together, also as citizens, obviously, and formulate new claims that they feel like are not represented in the narrower sense in politics. And in the case of Berlin, there have certainly been some sort of cross alliances between, for example, artists' struggles against displacement and tenant movements to make their claims to the claim their right to the city and join forces against displacement. But in comparison to other cities, maybe such as New York, there has been the cultural plan that has been initialized in the last 2-3 years, coming out of the mayor's office in New York, has taken a more outspoken approach to addressing all New Yorkers through cultural policy. So the subtitle of the cultural plan is for all New Yorkers, and it's this very all-encompassing, in a way, maybe also totalizing approach to assume that everybody has something to do with culture, which in the case of Berlin, I couldn't really detect so much. So probably when I'm just looking at who I spoke to and what the group was composed of that I studied, it is an agglomeration of many, in a way, expert-driven, artists as experts, expert-driven, entity that then tries to speak for more than the numeric the numeric entities that they can represent. So in that sense, this more representative approach to speak to civil society, maybe on a broader scale, scope, has been an idea behind this movement. So you saw me thinking in action. I hope that's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have not, physically thought about it.
Okay, good.
But if you have any questions or comments, let's just keep
talking.
First
of all, I think that agonism and antagonism were among the most essential characteristics of a movement called the avant-garde at the turn of the 19th and in the beginning of the 20th century. So it makes sense to me as well. Then I would make some observations on the Turkish scene, trying to see how we could relate and address not our national things, but try to find some general trends of what we are talking about. When I think of Turkey, for instance, of civil society, I mean, for the sectors, cultural sectors, generally speaking, or artists, I notice two things. First, that this is either vertical organizations and communication or horizontal, but not transversal. So it is not the independent coalition in Berlin where you had also different actors, not only the contemporary visual arts and so on. This is, even in Turkey, the theater people are reluctant to talk to contemporary performance. So this is a first observation. The second observation, back in 2011, we could draft as civil society cultural policy text per se. And our expectation was, as you said, to create a sort of an articulation of a collective art actor, which didn't happen despite the fact that we had the Gezi resistance and so on. So now I want to turn to Stephen and ask, throughout the post-apartheid era and lately, what's going on with the dynamics within civil society in the cultural sector and elsewhere?
So I think back to when we were trying to develop carnival in both nationally and in our provinces and in our cities. There was a request from artists themselves to help develop carnival programs and a carnival policy. There was no history of carnival in South Africa, but this came from the artists. And so I attended some meetings and conferences in the UK, understanding how carnival had developed there and in the Caribbean. And I got back to Johannesburg, and I was then director of arts and culture in the city of Johannesburg. And I went to see our minister for culture, our provincial minister, who was an old comrade of mine, you know, from the sort of anti-apartheid struggle. She's a minister now. Her name is Barbara Creasy. And I said to Barbara, you know, Barbara, I'm told that government can't deliver carnival to communities, that carnival has to be fought and won by communities. And Barbara looks at me and she says, Stephen, we are the ANC, we are the community. We can deliver carnival to the communities. And that has stuck with me, and it just tells us so much about the failure of the ANC and the fundamental failure of building civil society, because there's been this attitude, we are the people's government, we will deliver in their best interests. And so, you know, we can just take action and we can take steps and move forward on that basis. And so you'll see across, I mean, now built into what are called the IDPs, the integrated development plans of every municipality, there is a legal requirement that communities must be consulted and they must be asked what it is that they want. And so when I was in national government, just to digress in order to make a comparison and a point, when I was in national government, I was part of the experts team developing the UNESCO instrument for cultural diversity. And Dea, it was at that time that I got to Croatia, and we built up this extraordinary network. And the Canadians, so there was the International Network for Cultural Policy and the International Network for Cultural Diversity. And the Canadians and the Swiss and various countries were actively funding a civil society organization who were working in parallel with governments on the cultural diversity, UNESCO Cultural Diversity Instrument. And we had two sets of documents. We had the civil society documentation, and then we had our team of experts and consultants who we had hired. And then the negotiation happened between these two texts. But the processes happened separately. The INCP and the INCD worked simultaneously in their tracks and then had meetings as they moved along the way. Whereas our government, the ANC, at the local level, at every level, they've always had this attitude that they know what civil society requires. And so right now in South Africa, we have a new organization called I'm for the Arts, with the number 4, I'm for the Arts, and you should have a look at them and see what they're doing. And within a matter of weeks, they had 17,000 members. This all happened during COVID. And it has to do with the fact that the organization that was created by the ANC government to represent artists and foisted on the artists has been utterly rejected. And so you're getting this massive mobilization and this movement emerging in this COVID moment, interestingly enough, because artists have now really become so, their lives have become so precarious. And so many artists really are utterly desperate. And with our digital divide, there are millions of people who don't have access to online, to digital. So it's not a solution. It's been extraordinary for the middle class to be able to engage online and to have this new online creative and cultural life. For the majority of South Africans, this cannot work. And we have to get back to physical space and back into our infrastructure. And I think for the continent, the institutions that offer the greatest opportunity are the libraries. And I think we've got to be looking at libraries, the future of libraries on this continent, and how they become the new spaces in which people who are curious and people are creative and people are interested in culture already go, but we've got to extend the ambit of libraries, and they've got to become more than just about the book. They've got to become kind of new kinds of institutions. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Jordi, once and maybe still, Barcelona was considered to be the best case, the laboratory of cultural governance. I mean, for many aspects. So the problem that Stephen has just posed, I mean, the problem of legitimacy is and will be crucial for the future, because I think with this digital boom suddenly we were forced to be in, will change also our paradigm in cultural policy, because we were used to judge performance in cultural policy practices in terms of social and economic impact. Now I feel that we will have also to judge and assess the practices in terms of health consequences and then the ecological footprint. The floor is yours, Jordi.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you referred earlier to my work with the Committee on Culture of United Cities on Local Governments, the network of local authorities. And of course, United Cities on Local Governments has for many years worked or promoted an understanding of culture as the fourth pillar of sustainable development, and understanding that rather than seeing cultural aspects as a resource at the service of the achievement of goals in other areas like the economy or social inclusion aspects, like understanding the distinctive or the intrinsic aspects that culture can bring into the equation of coexisting within societies and with regard to the planet should be central. So hence the concern with diversity, with the exercise of cultural rights, with the recognition of memory and heritage, and the fostering of knowledge and the ability for communities to transfer knowledge as something that is essential. Now, I think indeed that remains a challenge, let's say, placing culture in a position that is more or less equal to the other pillars of sustainable development. And I think to a certain extent, going back to what we were reflecting on the previous question, I think the crisis of COVID has served to reinforce that big interrogation or that big challenge that exists around that. I think in terms of what that means for civil society, from my perspective, there's two or three important things. One is connecting cultural work with broader societal values and identifying those aspects in which values of openness, of mutual recognition, and so on, which are intrinsic to certain forms of practicing culture, can be connected to work in other areas of civil society that are concerned with sustainability. So I see a sphere which might connect some cultural work, educational processes, and a certain ethics of care, which is promoted by health professionals, for instance, and social workers and so on, which embodies a certain understanding of society that is concerned with sustainability. And affirming that also involves being aware of which are the values that should not be central, or that central to that understanding of culture and sustainability. So increasingly, I would place emphasis on the importance of collaboration and togetherness, and bringing together forces and overcoming fragmentation and competitiveness. And I think increasingly those should be values that underpin and on which we can assess the work that is being done. I suppose at the same time, there is a potential for cultural work and for initiatives within civil society to reflect on how cultural factors can contribute to adaptation to more sustainable ways of living, and also somehow enabling the emergence of a different relation with time. So to a certain extent, those of us who have been in lockdown, we've somehow experienced a different way of looking at how that time passes by. And at the same time, we also need to develop a different form of relation with time as regards the planet. So I think there is a potential for cultural work to help us reflect around that. And ultimately, I mean, I think there's been very interesting examples being given by both Friederike when reflecting on the case of New York, and Stephen going back to how the UNESCO Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions was adopted as somehow a joint effort of public authorities and civil society. And I think to me, that ultimately also reinforces the need for a transformation of the governance models that are existing in cultural policy, and the need to move towards more horizontal models in which both citizens and civil society organizations can take part, and going beyond the tokenistic gestures of, let's say, consulting at particular points in time, but no more, and somehow developing models that can make that continuous. And somehow that horizontal understanding should also mean somehow breaking the barriers or the silos that often separate different areas of public action. So again, going back to that concern with education, with health and well-being, with an ethics of care, and also caring for the planet. So that should increasingly be part of reflections in a more systemic and ecosystemic way, I would say.
Thank you very much, Jordi. I remember when we were starting to work on Turkish cultural policy and the civil society cultural policy, I remember Croatia has been given us as a good case. And at that time, there was a steady dialogue between civil society representatives in the ex-Yugoslavian territories, at least in most of them. So as you are in constant dialogue and contact with the civil society organizations in Croatia and also in the Balkans in general, but Europe, how would you see the role of the civil society? And I would like to add on that, seeing also our timing, could you possibly share with us a good case of a civil society initiative, or with the participation of civil society, or even a bad case could teach, that you could nominate here so that it would also enrich our discussion there?
Yeah, thank you for your questions, and that the Croatia was like a great example for you in Turkey, and probably it's also the case with some other countries, especially in our region of post-Yugoslav countries, which in many cases, when we compare to each other, many of the representatives of civil society organization in other countries, in Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, and so on, look at the Croatia, and of course Slovenia, but especially Croatia as like a purple example of how things can organize in a systemic way. And one of the main step forward to this system, it was related to establishment of Culturanova Foundation, which is basically results of successful advocacy initiatives led by civil society organization, meaning non-profit, non-governmental associations which work and operate in contemporary arts and culture, which come together and as a reactions to the whole cultural system, came out with the idea of establishment of separate foundation, which would be dedicated completely to their interest, purpose, and needs as an answer to the existing cultural model, which in Croatia basically did not experience any systemic change. So it means that it's still developed on the legacy of the socialism time, so of the time of the Yugoslavia, dominantly focus on the public sector and providing financial support to public cultural institutions, which is really good because thanks to this kind of the approach of the cultural system, we still have really strong the public cultural institutions in Croatia, but the problem is that the whole sector, the public sector, didn't change itself, you know, especially in the sense of inclusion and participation of the citizens and of their mandates of the public interest. So talking about the Croatian example of civil society organizations, we can talk basically from two different perspectives. One is tackle the aspect and the condition of in which they work, and another one is tackle the aspect of their legitimacy, of good practices, and what they can basically do, and what could be the role of the, or what is already the role of the civil society organization in Croatia or wider in Europe on the global level. So I will say that talking about their role, it's, and especially according to the UNESCO Cultural Diversity Convention and all aspect which is tackled the issue of the cultural rights, that the role of the cultural civil society organization is the crucial, basically, for the issue of inclusion, equality, solidarity, and cultural democracy, at least ideal of the cultural democracy, because we know that this paradigm, this concept of the cultural policy failed somehow and didn't fulfill the promise of the notion of the cultural democracy. So in that sense, I see the role of the actors in the civil sector as a very, very important for the whole cultural system, and especially I see their role very important in the governance, cultural governance aspect, which tackled by Jordi at the end of his intervention. So since we basically have very centralized, very traditional governance model in culture still, and very, vertical, very hierarchical, organized in that sense, the role of the actors of civil society can really help in changing the governance system in general, but of course in culture per se. And this is somehow also the example which I want to bring to the screen and to our discussion, and which basically happen all around Croatia. But it's also, somehow comes from the condition in which the civil society organization operate, work, and develop in Croatia, but all around. And this precarious, which is became like a standard, especially for the cultural sector and the civil sector, but also in the creative industry, which is like trying or exploring the means of self-affirmation in the absence of different kind of the resources, materials, human, financial, spatial. The civil society organization try to build a variety of different kind of models in order to act effectively in the long run. So the lack of spaces, for example, for the implementation of their cultural, social activities, different kind of the artistic practices, encourage them to cooperate and share the spatial resources of abandoned buildings, former military buildings, factories, and many others, and started to use, by many users, sharing their responsibility in a governing of that infrastructure, which is in a Croatian cases usually public infrastructure. So it's this fact also pushed them in a further step, and trying to build and to establish a civil-public partnership around this new generation of the cultural centers, which they started to build in the last 10 years in different cities around the country. And these emerging centers, which is results of these bottom-up initiatives, which, as I said, based on the principles of peer-to-peer, solidarity, shared economy, shared resource, and using, the spaces by different users, different organizations. But since they use the public infrastructure, they started to advocate the participatory governance model and started to negotiate it with the public authority to come and to build together the civil-public partnership and to open decision-making process, and basically to share responsibility on governing this spatial resources all around the country. Of course, as I said, in Croatia, we have plenty of examples now, and we can have and find the different examples all around Europe, in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Berlin, and so on. But all of that models really depends on the context. So we can't say that this model is like replicable or provide a recipe based on which you can cook, your own model based on the participatory governance. But what does it make differences compared to the traditional governance model is this opening the decision-making process and encouraging citizens to enter and to share responsibility in the process of making a final decision. So in that sense, to this kind of building of the partnership between the local authority and civil actors, the different actors find a different kind of the benefits, I mentioned this encouraging citizens to enter in a decision-making process, but talking about the local authorities, one of very important aspect is building their capacity for collaboration, but also to testing, using the culture as a main laboratory for testing a new governance model, and especially, you know, to rethink the role and the mandate of the public cultural institutions. And is it possible to organize the way how and the nature of the and the structure of the public cultural institutions in some another way in order to open their walls, you know, and or to crush the walls and to involve the citizens in the different kind of the process and different layers of these public institutions. But of course, a lot of and plenty of challenges appear around these practices and tendencies of participatory governance. One of that is probably very important, is a trust or a distrust among different stakeholders. It's also the fact that many actors see only the problems without any idea of the solutions. And this is something what we really can find in a public sector, in a public authority. But one of let's say, greatest challenge for these social cultural centers is how to affirm cultural rights and how basically to introduce inclusion and deliberation tendency in cultural decision-making process, and at the same time avoid the populism and reproduction of anti-democratic tendency. So this opened up the issue of clarity and dynamics of actions directed at creating a cultural participatory practices in society, which is increasingly sliding towards sharp division and inequalities. So here, plenty of questions appear. For example, how should the frameworks for participation in such contexts be set? How should participation as one of the acting and decision-making principles be introduced and avoid contamination by the original power relations? Or which and what kind of elements of participation should be secure for free and persistent inclusion of the excluded? And I will leave you here with all these questions that can be used during our discussion.
Thank you, Dea. Your questions will help us for further now talk, because I think that we all know that cultural policy at the city level existed since several times. But after the post-COVID, I mean, we can notice that cities are becoming the real actors. And I would even say cities at a smaller scale. Because when we think of New York, London, Madrid, Milano, Moscow, and so on, the cosmopolitan metropolitans, so-called, which were the ideal when we were having cases to state and so on, and which were also in a competition for the global list of metropolitans. They were severely hit with all their speed, with all their crazy mobility and so on. And recently, as you all know, with the 2020 Rome Charter, which starts like, we the people are the cities. So, I mean, there might be maybe a change on the way we see also the city dynamics, and your case of new generation of cultural centers, with the civil society pulling up or pushing the public authorities to be also in sort of a contact, in direct contact with the citizens. Jordi, you know, and you followed the case in Barcelona and elsewhere, how would you evaluate the situation of cities regarding the, let's say, the cultural policies in the future?
Yeah, that's a huge question. So I'll just try to raise some ideas and open the dialogue.
By the way, we have only 30 minutes left. So
okay,
if
fine.
we can spare another 5-6 minutes at the end, just for eventual questions or comments, and I will very quickly wrap up at the end. Thanks.
Sure. I don't know, very quickly. I suppose there's an important focus on opportunities for cultural participation in proximity or in small community scale. Let's say the possibility for increasing work in decentralized manners at neighborhood level, etc. And I think that linked to that is, on the one hand, a more open approach to what cultural forms are seen as legitimate in the public sphere and what are, let's say, what contents can be part of the sphere of cultural policy, but also a stronger emphasis on mediation by cultural managers, and somehow, let's say, and with that comes being more open to working out of traditional cultural venues, establishing collaboration with different local actors, etc., and also reflecting on the governance, not only the governance of broader local cultural policy at the city level, say in terms of having spaces where the main decision-making can take place, but also the governance within organizations, so bringing in the communities more. I think also partly linked to that is exploring the potential synergies with initiatives in the social economy, for instance, and initiatives of cooperatives and alternative models of business that try to find the balance between environmental, social, educational, and cultural initiatives. So I think there are in cities like Barcelona, there's very interesting initiatives taking place at the neighborhood level, which often don't come from culture, but in which there is a potential common ground with cultural and creative initiatives. So I think there's some potential for that. And then I think another interesting reflection to me, and maybe I'm going a bit out of the question, but to me it's also an important reflection in this context is the need to avoid an excessive focus on the event nature of culture when we think of culture in cities. And I think that's been an issue of concern in the last few months, where, let's say, a lot of the reflection around cultural life and the reopening of cultural life has focused on aspects of the ability for, let's say, for people to go to shows, and that's an important aspect of cultural life. Don't take me wrong, but I think it's important to see cultural life in a more ecosystemic way and understand that it is as important to have short-term activities as it is to have grassroots venues, libraries, community centers, things that happen on the streets, and so on, and a broad range of activities that are all as legitimate and as important and as part of cultural dignity, and which should be recognized as part of cultural life. So just sorry for just giving a few snapshots, but I think these are some of the things that come to mind with regard to this.
Okay, you introduced two important concepts, Jordi, as far as I'm concerned. One is the cultural participation, even at a smaller scale, in proximity in the neighborhood, because we were all thinking usually at the city level, city being several tens of thousands of inhabitants. And the second concept, which is cultural dignity, which I think goes in line with cultural justice somehow, because democracy is a higher concept somehow, a supreme concept, but we have to build right now on the very foundations of the cultural democracy to be able to go upscale. Thank you. And Friederike, you are not only a scholar. I know that you were among the initiators of a project in Vienna, Agonart, and you were also, during your research, you were actively involved in the cultural, let's say, activism of cities. What would you see in prospect for the cultural policy at the city level, as far as your experience is concerned?
Maybe just to clarify that the project Agonart hasn't started yet. The official starting date is December of this year, so we haven't done any empirical research. It's me and a couple of collaborators from the University of Vienna. I think it's been very interesting, and there's like parallel things happening in my mind in terms of talking about how to think about cultural governance and not only cultural policy. And I think a lot of the things that have been said, both from the sort of like ecological perspective or the sort of like collaborative model that Dea was describing, lead up to this sort of like potential of arts and cultural policy to say something about future modes of governance. That's also something that I'm looking at in a concurrent course about the project Agonart, which is called Cultural Politics, Policy and Activism, to kind of like blur all the boundaries between these terms of like, is activism something different than policy making?
And they're practically also blurred. I mean, we want it or not, yeah.
But what I'm interested in terms of also thinking about the future is what will remain from this time that we're in? What learnings? You also asked about successes and failures, or good examples and not so good examples. What is going to be the legacy of this crisis? Also in terms of institutionalizing new policies. So, I mean, human beings have a tendency to forget certain things, but also, human history or anthropogenic history has evolved over time. So I'm just interested in thinking about, or also discussing, rather than making my own statement, what we think we should carry over from this crisis in terms of how to develop cultural policies, or like thinking about new forms of activism. I think what Dea was mentioning, seeing this sort of like transition into the policy-making apparatus and inviting civil society stakeholders into talking about spatial resources and talking about, post-industrial or post-military buildings and stuff like that. That's a way of considering the city as an arena that belongs to us all and that invites us all. So maybe those are things that we need to remind ourselves when we're developing future cultural policies.
Well, thank you very much. Could you a little bit detail to us what's going on now with the Independent Cultural Scene Coalition in Berlin? In Berlin. After almost 10 years now? 8?
Yeah, it's 8 years. So I was just talking about institutionalization. There is some tendencies of partnering up into working groups, so kind of like division of labor to relieve some of the activists from a very high level of personal stress and engagement, because activism is emotional labor and often unpaid labor. So that's one thing that I've noticed. I mean, I'm not following them as closely as I used to, but I understand that some of the practices that have kind of grown very organically have now become formalized, for example, in working groups. Also, again, relating to what Dea was saying, there has been more of a focus on space. I mean, studio space, rental space, public space in the city of Berlin has always been a big topic. So this ongoing spatial crisis of affordable studio spaces.
And gentrification consequently.
Yes, absolutely. I always, think of that when I speak about Berlin, right? So another thing that I have noticed is, besides the organization and collectivization in a discursive realm, or claiming artist fees or claiming better working conditions and stuff like that, so the people-focused policies, the Coalition of the Independent Scene has also moved on to focus a lot on place-based policies. So for example, there is one concrete object of desire called the Alte Münze. It's an old coin factory, which is very central. It's basically across from the mayoral office in central Berlin, close to Alexanderplatz, which the Koalition der Freien Szene, the coalition, has been engaged in a participatory process, but also, like Dea was mentioning, the collaborative exercise of civic and public stakeholders and partnerships has been a process of what I would call conflictual collaboration. So certain things have definitely shown the limits of how far civil society's voices can go in these processes and how open they really are, or in what ways governance processes that claim to be participatory are still pre-structured and, in that sense, limited by public stakeholders. But it's interesting to see that there is a more concrete, in both senses of the term, concrete understanding of hooking to spaces within the city, within the central areas of Berlin, to kind of increase the visibility and the presence of independent cultural production. So the idea for the Coalition of the Independent Scene is to make studio space and performance space available in that old coin factory. So maybe those are two tendencies that I've seen: a division of labor and a more spatial focus. Thank you,
Friederike. Stephen, I noted from Friederike's, Jordi's and Dea's turns that there is this difficulty of having a civic public joint initiatives. Creating it is, you have to push. I think the main reason behind it that the public-private let's say initiative is an organic one. We call it neoliberalism or something else, but it is organic. That is why the civic public is difficult to achieve. So what goes on in cities and also in urban areas in South Africa? And I'm eager to know, to start with, what happened, I think 35 years later, that the Community Arts Center in Soweto was created.
Mm-hmm. So I was Director of Arts and Culture in the city of Johannesburg for a period of 7 years. And the greatest problem in developing partnerships and coalitions with the artist organizations is the Financial Management Act, the legislation that all our cities will have around how you are and aren't allowed to procure, and the manner in which you can use taxpayers' money to support arts organizations. And I think that the biggest challenge we have today, post-COVID, is if international relations, if our ability to cross borders, if our ability for artists in an artist studio in Cape Town or Johannesburg to go and visit an artist studio in Berlin and have an exchange program, if these opportunities have all come to a standstill, and this global and international dimension of the trade and exchange of ideas between an artist collective in Cape Town and an artist collective in Berlin, the fact that those are threatened means that what is happening increasingly is that local organizations are looking to the state to support them and to make up this gap that is appearing in the breakdown in international relations. And the state, in a democratic state, cannot operate unless, you see, libraries are interesting because libraries have with them what are called the conditional grant. Treasury sets aside in the annual budget, and it's condoned and agreed to by all of society that you would give money to support libraries. But there is no conditional grant for community art centers. There's no conditional grant for all the dance companies and music companies and all the not-for-profit organizations. None of them have conditional grants. They all depend on foundations and being able to apply on an annual basis for funding from a National Arts Council. And that is the crisis that we are now facing. And I was always very interested in how in welfare states, in Britain in the 1960s, artists in South Africa are primarily middle class. If you're a part of the working class, how are you ever going to be able to gain access to culture, to the life of an artist? And in Britain, the working class were able to do it through the dole, through the unemployed insurance that you could get. You could actually, cut an album, and you could have a garage band, and you could form a little theater company, and you could, use the dole to enable you to transition. And I think the big issue in South Africa now, and the biggest policy issue, is what is called the basic income grant. And if there was a basic income grant, that would enable unemployed youths who have talent, who have aspiration, to be able to get some money to enable to reproduce themselves, to then be able to produce their cultural content and produce and slowly try and break into the art world. So I think those two things, at the local level, in our context, a basic income grant; at the international level, the potential for us to continue to have fruitful collaborations between cultural organizations globally and exchanges between arts practitioners.
Thank you, Stephen. When I try to sum up what you all said, I am thinking, for instance, of this newly formed theater cooperative in Istanbul with 60 members. Most of them, they are so-called private, but they are all independent. And not only they are trying to create some advocacy work versus the public authorities for legislation, support, and so on, but at the same time, they are trying to find out dynamics of a new strategy to start with the independent, let's say, performing arts professionals to come together and create a common ground for not only survival, but maybe also development. So during our talk, I also noticed that we need a new generation of artists and cultural operators to have input in the cultural policies to come. For instance, in Turkey, I noticed that young, let's say, cultural entrepreneurs working independently to create festivals, little events, or collectives are coming together and starting to think in terms of a new independent way of approaching the totality of cultural policy work. And one thing is for sure, in continual conjuncture of crisis, the cultural policies will not be able to be the same, although they are for now, both in space and in time. And it seems that a sort of a transnational and transsectorial approach would be definitely needed. We cannot stay and eternally claim that the public authorities never help us, we don't have enough incentives, this and that. We have to invent, as we are on the creative part of, let's say, of life, new ways of talking to each other and trying to survive while also influencing other actors and other stakeholders. I guess that time-wise we are okay, unless there are some questions and comments. For now, there is a question from Monica Garcia. She would like to ask about expectations about the role of UNESCO in terms of leadership on cultural policy. Who would like to try? Maybe we can start with Jordi.
Hi, yeah, I'll try. Well, first of all, hi to Monica, who's a colleague. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the role of UNESCO in areas like this is, I mean, it's particularly important as regards setting global standards, and I think in particular that the Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions continues to be a certain charter that provides guidance on issues that are important and which, although are particularly relevant for national governments, can also be applied at other levels. And as was mentioned earlier, the convention was the result of a partnership between national governments and civil society, and it brings a particular importance to civil society. It recognizes the important role of civil society in cultural life. So therefore, I mean, I think that's a significant aspect which you can then adopt at different territorial levels. Connected to that, I think one potential role of UNESCO, which is already doing and which I think is important to continue, is to strengthen opportunities for networking of civil society at a global level. So somehow fostering the strengthening of a certain global mindset around issues that concern the relation between culture and sustainability at a global level, and bringing together initiatives that work in that respect at a global level. And I think another important aspect could be advocating for the recognition of the importance of cultural aspects as regards sustainable development policies within the United Nations system as an agency of the United Nations. I think there's still a need for cultural aspects to be better recognized in the Sustainable Development Goals, so in how they are being implemented now, but also in future similar agendas. So I think there's a role for UNESCO to continue putting pressure in that and advocating for that to be better recognized.
Thank you, Jordi. I noticed that while on the one side we see inequalities growing within societies, huge inequalities, on the other side, at the world scale, we can observe a sort of equalizing of conditions somehow. With what happened with this stop I mentioned in the beginning, this big, sudden and complete stop, because we couldn't believe that things could stop at that level because we were all running fast. And suddenly it stopped. And we were, us, talking about global south, global north, developing countries and so on. And suddenly we found ourselves almost reduced to the same position. Maybe it's a good start, the bad point becoming a more good, better point, starting talking to each other without this cleavage of making south, development and so on, especially in the cultural sector. So to conclude, I would like first to thank our hosts, BCF, Bosjada Jazz Festival, and their exploration team this year, which is mostly digital, which allowed us to come together, dear friends, and talk about cultural policies seen from our angles, but also generally speaking, and also with a specific reference to civil society and cities. Stephen, Dea, Jordi, Friederike, thank you all, and thank you, BCF. And bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Bye.
care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.